Just very quickly, Turn to Us is a 125-year-old charity. It used to be called the Distressed Gentlefolks Aid Association. It then became Elizabeth Fincare, and more recently Turn to Us. It is one of those kind of benevolent philanthropic organisations that came around during kind of the end of the industrialised era. Now, our vision is that we want to see a UK in which everyone has financial security so that they can thrive. We know that there are all of us will always have kind of life-changing events that come with financial shocks. But if we have the financial security, we can withstand them. And we are clearly seeing that that isn't the case for a very significant proportion of those of us in our communities. What we do is we offer support to those of us facing financial shocks, and together we want to challenge the systems and the perceptions that cause that financial insecurity. The way in which we do that is we make grants directly to families of about £4 million worth a year, around 4,000 families or so. We have a benefit calculator that last year 2 million people did 3 million calculations on, and Pro Bono Economics did an analysis that showed that £1.4 billion worth of benefits were claimed as a result. And there are about £15.5 billion worth of unclaimed benefits every year. So it's a reasonably significant proportion of the unclaimed bit. We also have a grant search tool so that anyone wanting to get a grant from another grant-making charity like Turn to Us can find that. And we have a lot of information on our website, as well as a helpline that last year 110,000 people called. That's particularly dedicated for people who have challenges accessing digital tools, but as we move into a very much more digital world. I want to kind of share a little bit about what our understanding is of the current cost of living challenges. And we tend not to think of it as a crisis. Much more, we think of it as structural. And the word crisis for us, it makes us concerned that it feels like it's something that can be solved and go away. Whereas actually we think this is much more structural. Before Ukraine's invasion, the kind of the supply chains in the world had already seen some failed crops in Yemen, and there had already been some kind of structural increases. And there's so little profit for so many food producers that any increase in labour, for example, in the UK because of Brexit, or production because of the increases in fuel, that meant increases in costs were passed on directly to suppliers like supermarkets and inevitably to customers. And those increases are affecting those of us with less income and less capital much, much more severely. Whilst we did see a drop in inflation figures yesterday for April, we know that food inflation, so the overall inflation drop come from 10 to 8%, but overall food inflation is much, much higher at 19%. Year-on-year increases. So, and figures from the Resolution Foundation last week showed that whilst fuel inflation is coming down from about 2,500 a year to 2,000 a year, food represents a much larger proportion of a normal household's expenditure at about 13% than fuel does at 5%. And there's something like 16 million households who are set to face a much bigger food than energy cost shock. And lower income households have a much worse hit. Food and fuel expenditure represent a much larger proportion of the total expenditure. And the gap between the highest in terms of income and lowest deciles is the largest on record in the UK at the moment. And when faced with increases in costs, consumers typically turn to cheaper options. But you can't do that if you're already buying kind of own brand products. You can't escape the increases, so you eat less, and that is what we have seen. And that explains why we're now seeing so many people coming to Turn to Us, simply because of the cost of living. Normally, we would see people coming to us because of relationship breakdown, bereavement, redundancy, disablement, and they've always been the main reasons for people coming to Turn to Us, those kind of life shocks. Now the largest proportion of people come to us are simply coming to us because they do not have enough on which to live. We recently had a call from a fully employed teacher who is married to a trainee nurse assistant, and they don't have enough to live on, and we're using tea towels as nappies for their babies. So it's very kind of real, and they'd never been in debt before. So it really doesn't help to call it a crisis. It's structural, and there is very little government action on the cost of food, like there has been government action on fuel costs. Instead, I think there's an acceptance on the need for food banks, which is just absurd in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We also saw during lockdown that those facing the most common and severe social barriers, like racism, ableism, queer phobias, or LGBTQI phobias, faced the worst impact from both infections and health, but also from the economic impact of lockdown. Black people and Asian people, particularly those from Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, saw a much more severe impact on their income, savings, and increases in debt. Social barriers equate to economic barriers. It's not very, very surprising. So what has Turn to Us done in response to this? Well, the first kind of concept is to understand that financial insecurity is a wicked problem. It's connected to safety and security. It's connected to housing precarity. It's connected to access to functioning markets, to a kind of economy. So in the way in which wicked and complex problems tend to be connected to other wicked and complex problems, that tells us that it is kind of the extent of the challenge is almost unknowable, and perhaps it is unknowable, and therefore it's absurd to think that one charity can solve a challenge like that in a family or in a person coming to us for support by itself, let alone the structural issues, which I shall come to later. So therefore, I think it is obvious, therefore, that Turn to Us must work in service to other organisations in local communities, whether that's one of kind of locality and geography, or it's one of identity or of faith, and we have to be working in local communities. And be working with a range of other charities, social enterprises, schools, GP surgeries, local councils, employers, and including the corporate sector. So one kind of immediate response is to work in deep collaboration, and we are learning how to do that more and more. Just to illustrate that, if we were just to make grants to people or make sure that people have the benefits, it wouldn't tackle housing insecurity or the impacts of housing insecurity, the impact of domestic abuse, the poverty premium where you have to pay more for everything because you don't have enough money to fix a washing machine, or and we know that utility bills and phone contracts are 30 to 40% more expensive if you don't have enough money to pay for direct debit. So that kind of poverty premium. We know that if we were just to make grants, we wouldn't tackle that insecurity created by immigration status. So all of us have to collaborate if we're to succeed. And what we have learned during lockdown is that when we make grants, instead of kind of in a very direct and transactional way with someone who comes to us, but if we make grants through a partner organization like Refuge, for example, two things happen. One is that it gives that organization is, of course, much better networked to understand who needs these grants, and they already have better relationships. And the person receiving the grant gets more kind of breathing space, mental kind of breathing space, and also trust the organization from which they were getting services in the first place to make more use of those organization services to tackle some of those kind of comorbidity issues that are making the financial insecurity worse. So that's an example of how we need to work in partnership. We have also been tackling, so a new program for us is kind of looking at personal independent payments. And those of you who know about the kind of the PIP process is that it is kind of it is run by DWP in quite a hostile environment way, as if you were an immigrant, and it is very difficult to get PIP. And 75% of people who appeal against their negative PIP ruling have it overturned. So you can see the difficulty of it. And shockingly, the reality is that 48% of those who live in a family with a disabled family member or who are disabled live in poverty. So in the UK, 48% of families with a disabled family member are in poverty. So we are designing a new benefit calculator kind of tool in co-production with people who are disabled and experiencing financial insecurity, and with Disability Rights UK, and I'm very excited about that new product. I strongly suspect that our next two speakers will talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. But something that I kind of want to impress upon anyone working in a charity is that if if we as charities are not tackling the way kind of equity, diversity and inclusion and belonging in the way in which we deliver our services and the way in which we run our organizations internally, we cannot succeed in our work. And I think that's true for all of our organizations, including, for example, environmental organizations, where I've heard it said, well, it doesn't really relate to the environment, into the climate crisis. But actually, those people who are experiencing the worst impact of climate crisis tend to be the people who have the least resilience to it. So, and who are creating the least impact on the climate crisis. So people who live on A roads, who live at the top of tower blocks without air conditioning, who are furthest away from some of those services, are more likely people experiencing social barriers. So you can see a direct connection between the climate crisis and issues around equity, diversity, inclusion and belonging. So we have to, all of us, I think, tackle that in the way in which we deliver our services and in the way in which we run our organizations. Turn to Us has put EDIB as a central core in its own strategy so that we are publicly accountable. And we are inviting people to hold us to account. We did an analysis of one of our grants and discovered the way in which we were making those grants were causing harm to people of colour. And so we immediately published that in the charity press so that we could be holding ourselves to account and inviting others to hold ourselves to us to account as well. Moving on to kind of systems change, I think it isn't acceptable for Turn to Us to kind of tackle poverty simply by making grants and making sure people have the benefits. Because if we understand that you are more likely to experience financial insecurity through racism or ableism or homophobia, then we can know that the economy is designed. Otherwise, it would be more random than that. And therefore, if we're kind of just making sure that people have got those benefits and kind of acting as a welfare organization, then we could be at risk of propping up a system that is dysfunctional and oppressive. And therefore, we are duty bound to tackle that system, otherwise we are complicit in it. So in order to do that, we are taking a new approach to understanding the ecosystem of change. What are the levers of change? Accepting that we will be able to contribute to the movement of making that change. There's no chance that Turn to Us can control it, and we want to be the change, not to be the problem. Just one thought about kind of the increasing spend that we have done during crisis is that if our response to crisis is only to kind of get more money out to people, but that we're not changing the kind of the factors that created the financial security for that family, then that money is kind of evaporating. And so we have to be determined that when we are increasing our spending in a crisis, we have to have a much deeper impact than just solving that immediate problem. And so we must learn how to improve people's financial security, much in the way in which a humanitarian response in an emergency situation would be rebuilding back better. So we have to be learning how to do that. And we are on a journey on how to do that. My kind of final few points is one on kind of co-production, one on safeguarding, and then the difficulties we've faced in moving into this work. So we often think, when I talk about co-production, we think about kind of the 4 streams of data we need to be blending together in order to understand how to improve our impact, not to prove our impact. I think if you set out to evaluate your work to prove your impact, you have already perverted the course of that. Whereas if you set out to understand how you can improve your impact, then you have a greater chance of doing that. And the 4 data streams are kind of the already published brilliant kind of data from organizations like Open University or from government, your own professional expertise. I've been working not since the 1970s, as Fidèle said, but since the 1990s. Otherwise, this is going to be some very good surgery. So since the 1990s, and so I bring some of that expertise. We certainly have the evaluation of our own programs in order to understand the benchmarking, professional expertise, our own evaluation, and the recent and current lived expertise of people who are experiencing financial insecurity. Those 4 have to kind of be blended together, and without it, we do not have the credibility to be doing this work. redesigned our benefits calculator completely in co-production, and the evidence that we had that is the right thing to do is that this huge increase in its use since we relaunched it. So I think co-production has to be critical, and I know that the previous session spent a bit of time talking about that, and I think that's right. Unless you have co-production from governance through to delivery, you're going to be missing opportunities for improving your impact as well as losing credibility and authenticity. Just a point on safeguarding. I know that Paul talked about it a bit, but for those of us who are facing financial insecurity, we tend to be at much greater risk of oppression. If we have less income, wealth, we'll find ourselves in increasingly precarious situations and more risk. So safeguarding has to be a major piece of the work in responding to crisis. And it has to have an equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging lens. There are some difficulties, it's kind of three things. So learning as you go, we have to be taking a kind of learning as you go approach in wicked problems, and the difficulty of funding, and tackling equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging in co-production with people who are experiencing challenge we have also found to be very, very difficult. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've done my 70 minutes. So thank you very much again for the opportunity. I look forward to the next speakers and the questions.
Thank you. So yes, we now invite Kaveed to come and give his presentation, and then Tom will be coming back to the question and answers. So you're welcome to switch on off your camera if you want, and then we will be asking you to switch it on again. Over to you, Kaveed.
Thank you, Fidèle, and thank you, Tom. Quite a tough act to follow. That was very, very interesting, and I think there will be a number of points that I will touch on during the course of my presentation that I think really echo and reflect elements of Tom's and Turn to Us's work. To kick things off, I was going to kick off with a little bit of a quiz. If everyone's all right, I'm trying to make my online presentations a little bit more interactive. So the title of my talk, my presentation is "Can't Knock the Hustle: Minoritized Communities and Cost of Living." But the title "Can't Knock the Hustle" is taking inspiration from a rapper's single in 1996. So I just wanted to very quickly check if we hopefully it works. If you guys are able to jump on Mentimeter and pop in what you think the answer to this question is. The 1996 single from a rapper called Can't Knock the Hustle. Who made it? I'll just give you a couple of seconds if people want to just jump on. If you can't access Mentimeter, do just stick a name in the chat. Interested to check everyone's hip hop knowledge. I've got a couple of answers jumping in straight away. I'll give it a second. Oh, can't access the poll. Okay. It feels like this is a conference with some good hip hop knowledge. I should have thought of a harder question. Yes, the answer is indeed Jay-Z, taken from Jay-Z's Reasonable Doubt album. So throughout the course of my presentation, given the title of it, I'm actually going to hang a few of the points that I'm making off Jay-Z lyrics. If you recognize the song that any of them are taken from, do pop it in the chat throughout. But yeah, thanks. So kicking things off, really reflecting on where we are now with cost of living in the United Kingdom. In our line of work at UKCF, and across the Community Foundation network, we're very much looking at cost of living in context of COVID. and what that meant, what we saw, what we witnessed across communities in the UK, but particularly minoritized, racially minoritized communities in the UK. We saw that COVID-19, of course, the morbidity rate, the legacy of health and social inequalities that I would say exacerbated. I wouldn't say it created, because I think, as Tom mentioned, when we're talking about these issues, they very much are structural. I think we all know a little bit about that, but actually, giving this presentation, if you like, looking at it through two lenses: one as a practitioner working for a funding organization, a funding network, but also somebody from a racially minoritized community. There were some interesting positives, if I can use that word, to take from COVID. I'm not sure if positives is the word, but a few interesting reflections, really. One really is that COVID-19 raised the profile of a few conversations that certainly across the Black Caribbean community that I'm a part of, we've been having for a long time, conversations around structural inequalities, how race and racism impacts on economic and health outcomes, and the impact that has on community resilience. And to an extent, we saw that resulted in more funding being directed towards Black and minority ethnic organizations, and in some cases better funding, less restricted funding, which again, was a positive. So as much as that, I think, led to some positivity across different communities, the flip side of that really is, I think, quite a latent perspective in some parts of the funding sector that, well, we've done it. We've had our conversation about race, about racism. We've directed some money there. Look, these organizations are better funded than they've been. And I think that really has teed up the challenge that we're seeing now, in that it's very easy for us to have a flash in the pan, a moment, which I think the sector, I think parts of the United Kingdom had a moment where lights were turned on to some of these challenges that Tom was speaking about and I'll speak about today now. But ultimately, those problems have not been solved. When we're talking about, and Tom used the term wicked problems, when we're talking about structural inequality, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about disadvantage, long-term disadvantage. These are structural wicked problems, and a couple of years of higher levels of funding and unrestricted funding have not really, in my view, moved us meaningfully closer to resolving some of the core challenges that sit at the root of these structural inequalities. But reflecting on COVID, it was interesting for us going into essentially what has been a response, a funding response to the cost of living. We completed some learning reports on the back of COVID-19, and a few things really stood out. The importance of relationships at a local level, that being the ability to understand what should be funded, the ability to fund quickly. We understand that needed to be supported by decision making at the, if you like, the lowest possible level. The less bureaucracy that is involved in decision making, usually the greater impact that grant has, because people who are closer to challenges, they understand the solutions more than anyone, and that really links to the idea that small thinking, local thinking in place is beautiful, especially in the context of a crisis. More on the word crisis shortly. And finally, I think the other thing that I've reflected on was this idea of data. and a few conversations really came up around this, where with other partners that we worked with, there tended to be a gravitation towards, well, we need data to understand what's happening. The idea that we could just, if you like, look at numbers to tell us what's happening in communities, particularly in racially minoritized communities. And actually, as much as there is good statistical data that can inform action, that can inform funding and direct it, actually it's insight, it's the intelligence that comes from people, that comes from relationships, people's knowledge of their place and knowledge of their communities, and the ability to leverage that helped us to respond fairly effectively, I think, to COVID-19, and that was the sort of learning that we took into the funding that we distributed really over the winter to across the UK in response to cost of living. That funding, just a note on that, was a combination really of locally raised funding from local philanthropists, a little bit from statutory partners, and a bit from a core corporate partner. But we also realized, actually, in context of this, that it's much easier to talk about the idea of crisis, of it being a crisis to raise funds, than to talk about it as a structural problem. And I think that speaks to a number of points that Tom was making. I think it's a little bit more comfortable to talk about the idea of a crisis, because then we don't have to look at the root cause. What we can look at is the here and now. What we can look at is a problem that we can solve, or an action that we can take that somehow we believe it can alleviate the situation, but I think fundamentally gives funders, or gives decision makers, an ability to say, well, we've done the job, as we saw with COVID-19. So just talking about cost of living itself for a moment, in our definition of cost of living, really we've been thinking about, yes, the rise in inflation and energy costs, and the general, your ability to live life with a degree of comfort and dignity, and how that is impinged upon by the costs are around you. So looking at it through that lens, and looking at it in the context of racially minoritized communities across the UK, it's very difficult to call it a crisis, because I think I would describe it as the conditions under which people live and have lived for a very long time in the United Kingdom. People from particular communities. There is a economic pattern, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, of people who are others, people who are different en masse, that they tend to experience throughout the UK. So looking at it through the lens of a crisis, although from a fundraising point of view, is perhaps a little bit easier. In reality, it goes far beyond a here and now crisis. The term that a few people have used to refer to it is, essentially, we're seeing communities in a perma-crisis, moving from one challenge to the next. We had COVID-19 a couple of years ago. As people are catching their breath, gosh, look at inflation, look where we are. But we're seeing that in the macro, in the micro, economic crises, economic challenges, a lack of economic resilience is a pattern. It's frequent. It's business as usual for many people from minoritized backgrounds throughout the United Kingdom. So what we tend to see in context of this is the idea of creativity. The idea that, as Jay-Z said, I get my bare any means on whenever there's a drought, get your umbrellas out, because that's when I brainstorm. The idea that in adverse conditions, our communities, people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in particular, but other minoritized communities, we become creative. And in some ways, it's been a badge of honor. It's something that that I've seen funding reports talk about over the years. It's something that I witness firsthand. This amazing resilience to, at a microeconomic level, to take the little bits, the little scraps, and turn it into something beautiful, to turn it into something that is powerful, to turn it into something that is strong. And that is celebrated, but ultimately, at a very personal level, that shouldn't really be the case. It shouldn't have to be the case that for local community organizations supporting people from minoritized communities led by these same people, they have to work in such a way that is especially innovative or especially creative to simply survive, to simply dispense with their duties. And I think that speaks to this longer term context that people from my community, from these communities, have been living in and operating in. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Where do we go from here? Well, I think what it tends to mean, and what we've seen in conversations that, if you like, our intelligence or our insight across the UK, is that it lends itself to short-term thinking. It lends itself to simply dealing with the symptoms and often not the root cause. Why? Because when your head is down, you're sort of focused on the way that you're going, and it's very, very difficult to get your head up and think farther into the future. And it's not to speak, I think, disparagingly of that, but I think these conditions lend themselves to a certain type of thinking, a certain type of response. And to an extent, I think funders can be guilty of almost perpetuating that, perpetuating short-termism, not thinking about what does this community, what does this place, what does this group really need to thrive in the long term. It's much easier to simply say, well, what we need to do is just get some funding into this place to solve this problem, or at least to tell ourselves that we're solving this problem, whatever it may be, in the short term. So what's the solution? There's a quote that I particularly like from Jay-Z on his 444 album. I won't say the whole quote, but financial freedom, my only hope. And I believe in the context of everything that we've been talking about this cost of living crisis, but actually about the economic permacrisis that many people from minoritized communities face throughout the UK. I think the idea of creating financial freedom has to be the longer term goal that we're working towards, particularly for minoritized groups. Why? For all of the reasons I've spoken about. Speaking as somebody who works for a funded part of the funding network, the relationship and the idea, there's been a lot of work, and I won't go too much into it, about the idea of power and redressing power in funding, and that's good. I think that's very good. I think it's very important, but there's a more fundamental question here, which is about how do we create financial freedom for the groups, for the people, for the organizations that represent some of our most minoritized communities, where actually there is not a fundamental dependence on civil society. And I think not everyone's going to agree with me, and I'm happy to sort of take questions on it or receive comments. But I think it is core to a longer term, more equitable society, that we look across the places and the communities within those places, those who are often most minoritized, most subject to, most affected by structural inequalities, to think, how do we really truly create the freedom and the resilience that comes from really capitalizing these communities. And I think my personal view, and this is, and I'll speak a little bit about how UKCF and the network is taking this forward shortly, but essentially there does need to be, in my opinion, quite a fundamental shift from simply funding the here and now, which we know is a challenge. Of course it will be, but really investing in the dreams and the aspirations, fundamentally the capability of different communities, of people from minoritized communities. And I think linked to that really is the idea of investing in the leadership of these communities and people from these communities. And for UKCF, I will stop sharing my screen now. And for UKCF, that's the conversation that we are having, and that we want to have. Because I don't think it's enough for us to raise money for a appeal, as good as it is, 12 to 15 million or so goes out cost of living, but that's not job done. The fact is, whenever there is a crisis, whenever there is a challenge, we see the same pattern of results, and we have to do something to shift away from that. So for us as an organization, the conversation that's very live for us, and I think the big bit of learning that we are seeing from the impact in communities, is how do we create that longer term resilience? And we know we might not have the answer at the moment, but we know there has to be an element of thinking around how do we capitalize these communities? How do we create greater financial freedom over a longer period of time? But also, how do we invest in the leadership capacity and capability within these communities to build a vision, a locally held or a community-based vision for those people in those places? Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveed, and I'm very sure there'll be questions coming up very shortly. But before we go to the Q&A, let's now move to Binita and her colleague. If they can switch on their cameras, then I'll switch off mine.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much, Fidèle, for the introduction, and thank you to everybody connected with the conference today for inviting us. And going to be talking about a very challenging subject of domestic abuse, incorporating the additional issues faced by ethnic minority communities. I would also like to thank Rani Court in supporting me with this presentation. And if I can, I'm trying to find Rani on the screen to come along and say a little bit about introducing yourself, please, Rani.
I'm very sorry, Binita. Rani isn't in our attendee list. Rani isn't here at the moment.
Oh, sorry, I've just had a message from her. There she is. Okay, I'll continue until we can find Rani, and then I'll let her introduce herself when we found her. And just to say, Rani is the chair of Board of Trustees. So earlier, when Fidèle was giving a little bit of my background, sort of said I've been working in this area for the last 21 years, and in the domestic violence sector. And Milton Keynes services is called MK Act. ACT stands for acknowledge it, call it by its name, and tell someone. As some of us will be aware, that domestic abuse is a taboo subject in quite a few communities to talk about. So just having that sort of encouraging title about it's important to acknowledge it as well, and tell somebody who you can trust, etc. It says it still raises awareness just through our name of the organization. So great. If I could sort of just briefly touch on the what the government definition of domestic abuse is, because domestic abuse is quite often not viewed inappropriately. So before I go into the definition, I've just seen Rani's camera come up. So if I take this opportunity, Rani, to ask you just to introduce yourself, because then we can carry on with the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, sorry about that, everyone. So I'm Rani Kaur, and I'm the chair of the board of directors and trustees for MK Act. And I've been on the board for about 12 years now. And obviously, we're here to talk about domestic abuse and the impact of the cost of living on our services and service users.
Thank you, Rani. So as I was just going to give you the overall government definition, it's basically the way it's worded is any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behavior, violent or abuse between those aged 16 and over, or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender and sexuality. The abuse can be encompassed, but it is not limited to psychological, physical, sexual, financial, and emotional. So this is a big point that I've come across throughout the time I've been doing this. Is quite often people identify abuse as just physical. So just to sort of really highlight the point here, it's much more wider than just physical. You know, it could be sexual, it could be threatening, verbal, economic, psychological, and other points, especially in the ethnic communities, is things like immigration is used as part of abuse, like forced marriages, honor-based violence. So there's loads of additional issues that wouldn't even come naturally to people who are thinking about domestic abuse. It's such a wide topic overall, and that's why it's sort of I sort of had it under a challenging topic. So, sometimes like if I start off with how MK Act is analyzing the data, that'll give you an idea of how many people across the board, across the world are sort of facing these sort of issues. But we're going to bring it back to Milton Keynes. So overall, when we are looking at data and statistics, we're saying 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. So, I mean, these are only figures that we have got into the phase of being reported and recorded. So we've got to be mindful that there are figures much elusive. Anyway, we're not really aware about what the real picture is, but this is sort of the data we are plotting today. And also, time is changing where, you know, men are talking about it a little bit more than they used to. That's important to recognize as well. So carrying on with a bit more, recognizing how it happens and who it happens to. So domestic abuse can lead to more dangerous situations, things like killing, murdering, etc. So 2 women a week, so we talk about nationally in UK, 2 women a week are killed by their partners or ex-partners. Now, we've got to recognize that domestic abuse is not only, especially within some of the Asian ethnic minority communities, it's not only between 2 partners, like man and woman, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, etc. It's much more wider, much more even more dangerous, because you know you've got abuse from own family because the person is not behaving how they're expected to behave, hence abuse starts. So it could be your own family, siblings, parents, uncles, aunties, and then it goes much wider after marriage as well. Other people, you know, could be part of the abusers, like in-laws, mother-in-law, father-in-law, husband, etc. So when we think about domestic abuse in the Western context, it's normally between 2 people, but here with the ethnic minorities, it's much wider. It's important to sort of be mindful about how much more in-depth things are here. So sorry, 2 women a week are killed, and 30 men are murdered per year by their partner, ex-partner. So 2 women a week and 30 men a year. So those are the figures we are coming through at the moment. And now about seeking help. So again, these are statistics about when people actually voice it and accept it, voice it, and ask for help. So a woman is assaulted average 35 times before she seeks help. So that's how much of a taboo subject it is. And remember, when you've got additional issues of izzat, being mindful of your family honor, being mindful of immigration, all those extra tactics, these figures are going to be even more sort of lower in how, higher in when they actually go and seek help. So especially, let me just sort of touch on about how immigration works. So quite often, if a woman is brought to UK as under the spouse visa after marriage from another country, one of the criteria the immigration system puts on her is she's got no recourse to public funds. So now, even if she was to want to access help, housing, benefits, National Health Service, all those things would be a barrier for her, because she's come across as a spouse and she doesn't have any rights into seeking help and get away from domestic abuse. So fortunately, after lots of lobbying with the Home Office have come up with a bit of an option of applying for immigration outside the spouse rules on her own right. But that's, again, if you know about it, if the woman has been informed about these options, then she can reach out for help. But quite often, due to being new to UK, language barriers, being kept isolated because all her family and support network is probably in another country, she would not know these services she can access. So cost of living is already one of the main topics we've been talking about. This is the topic we're talking about. But if you can remember that this is much, much deeper than that, this particular group of clients haven't even got any sort of option to access services in getting out of the situation of the abuse. So just quickly summarize about that option of coming away from the spousal visa. There are the Home Office can be contacted to access this woman with a visa called Live Outside the Rules, and then carry on with progressing with that when she can access recourse to public funds and stabilize her immigration status. So it's so many levels of deep thinking that comes in our area of work when we are supporting the additional needs for victims of domestic abuse. And we do appreciate that domestic abuse is not prevalent in any particular community, but it is the higher rate of those accessing housing is due to from the Black and multi-ethnic groups under the domestic abuse rule. So we're just trying to sort of give you a little bit of overview about domestic abuse, as well as how it's impacting our clients, especially with the crisis situation we're in at the moment, and the funding is so limited everywhere we turn. You're on mute, Rani.
Sorry, if we think about cost of living and the impact on survivors and clients and domestic violence services, 2/3 of survivors told us that abusers now are using the cost of living increase and are concerned about financial hardship as a tool for coercive control. So it includes justifying further restricting their access to money, or restricting women are thinking about, they're restricting about whether they leave or not because of the cost of living. So some, obviously, there's been lots of discussion today about the impact of cost of living because of increased utilities, heating costs, the cost of food. But some of the things that 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 we found is things like circumstantial depression. Because of the cost of living, there's more women and children going into depression. Women are asking more for loans from charities like us and externally, because they can't afford to replace items like standard things that we would we use on a daily basis, like washing machines, etc. There are more service users using food banks and food vouchers, but then not, to be fair, food banks are charities in themselves, and they don't always have enough to go round. So a lot of our clients are saying that they've had to reduce the amount of meals that they're actually eating. So if because of children, to making sure they're feeding their children first, and they might not be eating, or as a family reducing from 3 meals to 2, which, if we're thinking about we are a first world nation, I find that quite saddening. There's national research that has been carried out about the cost of living and the impact on domestic abuse survivors. And some of the things that have come out is, do I spend my money on food or uniforms, because I can't afford to get newer uniforms for my children that are going to school? I can't provide things that my children might need for school, for projects, etc., and therefore they're not getting the grades that they should be getting. There's obviously been a circumstantial increase in the cost of main food items like bread, milk, eggs. I mean, these are not luxuries; these are sort of basic commodities that have gone up by up to 42% respectively. So one of the issues that we're finding is that when service users, if they're moving out of refuge, or depending on where they live or are moved to, there might not be school places local to where they're living. So, and because of the cost of fuel, they can't actually afford to take their children to school. So there's lots of more higher increase in absences of children not engaging in the school, because the parents can't afford to take them, because it's quite far out to where they've actually been placed. 3/4 of women, that's 73%, are living with financial links with the abuser, and the cost of living has either prevented them from leaving or made it harder for them to leave. And so we need to think about that on a sort of bigger scale, and think about, well, what can be done due to that fact. So, sorry, Binita, I'll pass it back to you to cover your how that relates back.
Yeah, again, what everything you've been talking about there is absolutely so relevant. And also, to add to that, when a woman is new to UK and unfamiliar and facing not only domestic abuse but the cost of crisis as well, it's just unthinkable, some of the cases we deal with. What are you doing? I think you're still on mute, Rani.
Sorry, Fidèle. I was saying I'm conscious of time, so I like to stick to time. So I think, I mean, in summation, I think we're a local service to Milton Keynes, but we are part of the National Women's Aid Network, and this is an issue across the board. It's not just local to us, but the specific things I've talked about are quite specific to us. And what we've experienced for our organisation.
Thank you, Rani and Binita. So what I'm going to do is to ask all our previous speakers, i.e. Tom and Kaveed, to come back again on board. Yeah, so we are there. Okay, yeah, perfect. So we may do improvise a little bit here, because my colleague Daniel might come on the screen to actually, because he has been monitoring the Q&A while the chat while you are talking, and trying to see if there are questions. And if there are no questions, I put him on the spot. He will have to ask the questions if the audience did not participate. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Fidèle. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for all the contributions from the presenters. Really interesting topics. We've not had a massive amount of traffic in the chat, so if you've got any last-minute questions, get them in now so we can ask. But we did have a comment from Mark Freeman, which prompted a bit of a discussion in the chat box about this debate, which is a perennial debate between long-term funding and short-term funding. And Kaveed mentioned the short-termism that can happen from always trying to innovate and be creative and be resilient. So I was wondering if any of the other presenters might want to sort of comment on that. Just to quote Mark fully, he says, "We keep talking about long term, and yet funding is never long term. To build the trust and make the changes in communities, you need time, and short term projects often make things worse. How do we find real ways to fund communities for long term change?" So that's the question.
Rani, I mean, yeah.
I mean, in our experience, we found that and commission services work. We are a commissioned contract, and we find when we went for the commission contract, we looked at what is the most important service or services that the community needs, that Milton Keynes needs. So our long-term funding came in that way. And now we do go for a lot of short-term projects, in fairness, and I agree that they don't always alleviate a problem in the long term. However, they do sometimes create a good starting point of areas of, like, for example, in domestic violence, we've got kids play projects, and we've got women in work projects that Binita might want to talk about, but that's a funded project. And that's getting survivors of domestic abuse, getting them into work if they don't have experience, because that's what employers say. Well, you don't have experience, so we can't get you a job. But we've got a small funded project for that, which gets the women experience, which gets them. We work with a lot of employers locally that the women go into, and that project, if we don't get it refunded, we've built a relationship with employers that we will still continue that work going forward. So there's different ways to sustain projects long term, even if it's not from a financial perspective, but that's in our experience.
Shall I just add the bit about the women in work that Rani that you touched on? So we found throughout the recovery period of the clients, is like encouraging them back into rebuilding their confidence was quite a difficult task. So then we've applied for funding where we can start the work in-house, as it were, because within the Milton Keynes domestic violence organisation, we've got community work as well as refuge, where the temporary accommodation is, and that really helps us. This Women in Work Skills project helps to rebuild their self-confidence, self-esteem, and help them to start with the recovery process. But it is so worrying that it's such a short-term funding, that all the good work they put into it is a threat.
Yeah, and we do look for unrestricted funds as well, because obviously we find funders have very specific criteria for specific things that that organisations can go for. So we tend to look for more unrestricted funds, which gives us more opportunity to work on projects with a little bit more longevity. But also we have management pot as well, where when we get funds, a percentage of that goes into a management pot, which we can use then to fund to continue funding projects as well.
So I see, Tom, you had your hand up first, and then Kaveed.
I'm really interested in what Kaveed's got to say. I think because I think ultimately the kind of paternalistic nature of the charity sector is part of the problem. So the power dynamic of going cap in hand to people with resources, instead of it being a partnership between people with the kind of the funders with the resources and the organizations with the expertise, so and increasingly I think there are some very good funding examples of that, and I would include Kelly Chase. There's a couple of groups coming together of funders, one called the Foundations of Social Justice, another one called the Regenerative Futures Fund, based in Edinburgh, led by Leah Black. So there are some moves towards, look, we need unrestricted 10-year funding, investing in great social enterprises or charities that are achieving great impact. We shouldn't be, restricting the funding. So there is a move to that, but ultimately there is a dysfunctional power dynamic with kind of the institutional funders, or even funding from government, where you get gagged a bit. So I think that's a bit of reality, but there are some great examples of that changing. I think what that means for us as charities is that we've got to get bloody good at fundraising. And really creative about the ways in which we can get that unrestricted funding. And this is my first time in my career working at an organisation with significant reserves, and I've only worked in kind of hand-to-mouth organisations that were kind of 500,000, and by the time I left them, they were kind of 2 or 3 million a year. And what we got very good at Prisoners Abroad, and now in the HIV charity, and at Confronting Conflict, was launching major donor fundraising, was launching corporate fundraising, and making sure as much of that money as possible was unrestricted. So there is a lot of expertise in the sector about how to get very good at fundraising and to build your financial resilience as a charity. And it can be expensive to buy, fundraisers. There aren't enough fundraisers in the sector. So I would encourage you to think about growing your own fundraising expertise within yourself as a chief exec or within your team. And I think that the other thing is about kind of the design of your program. So as you design a program, thinking about the launch of a program, instead of it kind of designing everything perfectly and then trying to get to it. Often if you kind of design a perfect program and then you apply for funding, and the funding takes 8 months to get there, and then you recruit a kind of team and that takes another 8 months. By the time you launch, sometimes it's as often as 2 years since you designed the program, by when the world has changed so dramatically. And what you'd originally applied for isn't quite right. So I would think instead about kind of taking a very agile approach, and I know it's a very kind of buzzy word, but the tech sector is good. So designing something that is just good enough and building on it as it succeeds, and paying a lot of attention to its replicability and scalability. Because if the only way you can grow the impact is by growing the team, then the concomitant increase in the cost will be disabling as you want to improve the impact. So designing from the get-go about what is scalable without a concomitant increase in cost.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think Tom, cut through a few of the things that I was going to mention. I mean, working back from the idea around fundraising, I think the comment I would add to that, as a network that deals with a lot of flow through funding, and funding that is generated from local philanthropists, this idea of the kind of stricture around what we can and we can't do for us is a sort of a perennial challenge, because actually what we find is that a lot of donors want that kind of structure around it, and often it's because this idea of reporting, because of the idea of impact. They're not the same thing, but I think they're often conflated. So there's probably a little bit of a job around actually for us, but actually I think similar organizations at large kind of reframing the idea of impact a little bit, because I think impact is often seen as this kind of retrospective reporting. I think it's something a little bit different. So I think for us to start thinking about how we can remove some of that restriction around things, I think there's a bit of influencing that needs to be done, I think, with communities of donors, and we're doing some of that work at the moment, but I think that's that is longer term. And I guess what I was getting at in my presentation, and I think it was Tom's initial point, really is something more fundamental than just about whether a project can get funding or where that works in the sort of type of funding, whether that's commission service or not. And it's more the fundamental idea of the model that sits within the sector. And I think for me, underpinning, particularly when I'm talking about Black and Asian communities in the United Kingdom, really the idea of owning that funding model, the ownership that these communities have within that, because I think that for me is a cornerstone of strength. The idea that there is an economic resilience which is within that community, which is not determined by the funding ecosystem. And actually, I think there's a challenge for funders to think, how do we do that? How do we create that longer term ownership of a funding model, of a capability, of a capacity, of a leadership, whether that is through fundraising, whether that is through endowments, whatever that is within these communities, in these places. Because actually, I think as much as it's really well intentioned, when we have conversations about, oh, we need to share power and platform all that, I think there is an innate, and I don't think it's the intention, there's an innate condescension. And I think what I am really passionate about and keen on is the idea that we build within some of our most disenfranchised communities who have been experiencing structural inequity for a long time, an ability to build real strength, not strength which is given, not strength which is determined or lent, but built from within. And the role that we can have in building that is a thing I'm very excited about. And I'm not sure what that is at the moment, but I think there has to be a model which is less paternalistic and one that creates a real deep ownership of that asset within the community, within those communities. I think that was kind of where I was going with with my point about the long-term thinking.
So time is not on our side, and I can see there is a lot of action in the chat, actually, a lot of questions. So maybe the presenters, if you can, go to the chat and answer the questions, because we are keen to stick with the time we set, which is lunchtime. We stop in 10 minutes, and then we give people about 35 minutes for a break, lunch break, and then we resume again later, because if we delay, then it means people will have no break. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank, obviously, our speakers, Tom, Kaveed, Rani, and Binita, for joining us and for the excellent contribution. And, so thank you very much. Highly appreciate it. In particular, some people who are more or less away from their normal basis, but who have made an effort to join us. And I'm looking at Tom and Kaveed here, because I know you made a big effort to join us, and it is highly appreciated. So while I sum up so thank you very much, and maybe we can ask people to give, the way we say thank you nowadays, because you can react. When you react, you can clap. If we can do it, then our speakers will know that we appreciate their contribution. And hang around, and hopefully some of you will be able to join us when we have a networking session in the afternoon, and people will talk to you. If anybody has got a final parting word, I'm happy to allow you to do so. So, because your cameras are still on, so maybe you have a parting word. If you want to share it, by all means, go ahead. Who wants to start? Tom.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to join. What a really great panel. And I did see a question about what are the kind of qualities that you need to be as a chief exec or a leader in a sector. And I suppose it's, in a world in which there is so much volatility, then I would say, very good, strong financial skills, or make sure you've got the financial skills around you, as well as that kind of commercial edge to know how to generate income.
Yeah, that's very good. You are even able to squeeze in an answer. Thank you. Kaveed?
Again, thank you. Pleasure to be on the panel with Ronnie and Tom and Binita. There was also a question in about partnership working, really, and I think about deeper partnerships. And my parting word on that really is before partnership, I think, needs to come understanding. And my parting word really is, before you think about the idea of a partnership and an end goal, really try to understand and not just the motivations, but the values of partners. Because I think as we move more, if we're talking about equity, we're talking about creating that is very much ideological. And I think I would say just don't be afraid to really probe the values of potential partners as a starting point to developing meaningful partnerships.
Thank you. And Binita and Rani?
Thank you, Fidèle. I was just about to switch my camera off when you started saying the names out, so I thought I will just depart with saying raising awareness to acknowledge it, call it by its name, and tell someone. Thank you all.
And Rani?
I was going to say thank you for having us. It's been brilliant, and I've enjoyed listening to everybody. And if you would like to, if you've got any questions afterwards for us, because I do have to go off to something else this afternoon, then you can just email us, and Heidi's got our emails, and we're happy to address anything. But again, as Thomas said, I think to answer one of the questions as the last party note, for charities, it's always good to be financially stable and less reliant on things like commission contracts. So look at your core competencies and see what you can expand on those.
Thank you very much. And, so a great panel. And, hopefully we'll see some of you in the afternoon when we open the mics for everybody. There may be some questions which people had and they didn't get a chance to answer. So very quickly, just to sum up what I drew from the session myself. I mean, it was very interesting that we had two funders. It wasn't by design, by the way, it was just by accident. But also should stress that when you were organizing this conference, it was very clear that we needed to have a panel on diversity. And the reason being that obviously, we spoke about COVID and how it exposed racial inequalities. We spoke about Black Lives Matter, and it is also part of the work we've been doing for the last while at CVSL. We've been doing some research around how the service providers are engaging or not engaging with racialized minority networks. So it's an ongoing piece of research. And if anybody is interested, we have an event on June 22nd. We'll be sharing it in our resources. You'll be more than welcome to join us. It will be short. It's only, a webinar, so it shouldn't be too long if you can spare some time to join us. We are also conscious of the fact that there are people are experiencing disadvantage and exclusion. So over the last 2 years, within the business school at the Open University, we have been working on an access module for Black students who are, in a way, we are not hitting our target. So we thought, and through our community partner, we thought we would try to start looking at ways of including groups who are not excluded and bringing on board people who are not in. So we are using this course we are developing. It's called Black Leadership and Empowerment Program as a pilot to explore how we can be more inclusive in terms of communities who have been experiencing disadvantage. So watch this space. It should be launched in October, and more information to come. You have also been encouraged to complete the polls. I've been checking the numbers. They are not everybody who is here has been completing the polls. So if you click on the polls icon, you can always contribute to the poll, even if it is not visible on your screen. So it comes on, it pops up. So fill it. If you can't, just do it thereafter, because we are keen to hear what you have to say. And one of the things I'm getting from the session, which is very profound, having spent a lot of time in the voluntary sector, is this how to balance keeping the mission of an organization, a voluntary sector organization, making sure I don't experience mission drift, but at the same time, looking for money, but not being driven by money and ending up doing what you don't intend to do. But also, it is very clear that we have been told time and time again throughout the day that we should always look at the cause rather than deal with the symptoms, because some of the issues we have been talking about today, they are symptoms of what is wrong. If we spend a lot of time and money trying to address symptoms without looking at the cause, I think that's an area we have to think about very carefully as we move forward. As always, it's easier if you are sick, you go to the hospital. It's one thing, the doctors, cleaning the wound you have and then putting on a plaster. If there is an infection, they have to do more than just giving you a plaster. So let's make sure that, whatever we do as a sector, we not only look at addressing the presenting issue, but also looking at why people are coming. There was a question earlier which we didn't get a chance to ask. Maybe it will come up. Lately, we are seeing a lot of photoshops taking place at the likes of the food bank, as an example. So, is it something we should be celebrating, or should we be ashamed by people who have nothing to eat to the point of going to the food bank? Should we be doing more? Should we be making sure people have their own food, they are resilient, rather than them coming to the food bank, for that matter? We were also delighted to have the MK Act to come here and talk about a subject which is taboo in some of the communities. We don't want to talk about it, but not talking about does not mean it goes away. So it's great to have a variety of discussions during the session. It's great to share the resources, which we have seen. A lot of resources have been shared, and we encourage people to continue to share. And when we put together a pack to send to the participants today, we will make sure that those resources are captured. So I am looking forward to seeing you at 2 o'clock. No, it's not even 2 o'clock. We are resuming at 1:30. So you have got 36 minutes to be sure to go and have your lunch, stretch yourselves. And if you can, we had asked people to post pictures of what they could see outside, where if you get a chance, by all means, share your posts. And remember to continue to tweet as we go along. And thank you very much. And we see you at 1:30. Over and out. Thank you.